When looking at the history of Miami, its first settlers, we have to go back more than 10,000 years. Now, these original inhabitants of Miami would settle alongside the Miami River along its banks looking into Biscayne Bay. Now, the Miami that they saw more than 10,000 years ago was actually pretty similar to the Miami that we saw about 200 years ago. The Florida Everglades were wide and vast throughout the entirety of South Florida, going all the way out to nearly the Atlantic Ocean, offering very little coastal land to actually be able to settle. In looking throughout the area, you would see pine woodlands, not to mention wildlife like deer and bears going all the way through Miami-Dade County. Now, as far as actual civilization in the modern sense, we look to 1513 and Ponce de Leon. Now, Ponce de Leon will sail into Biscayne Bay, however, he will never step foot in Florida, nevertheless Miami. However, he doesn't give it that name. Instead, he calls the area Chiquestia. Now, as for actual stepping foot into South Florida, that honor will go to Pedro Menendez de Aviles more than 50 years later in 1566. It is during this time that he will step foot and actually meet a group of settled Native Americans known as the Tequesta, which had lived throughout South Florida and upper parts of the state. However, when he does come to the area, he also brings with him smallpox, which over the next 100 to 150 years begins to wipe out the Tequesta civilization. The Tequestas would try to settle either in the Bahamas or even going so far as Cuba, but by 1800, they were gone. Now, as for the Spanish, their activity stopped in 1570 when the Jesuit mission that was placed in Miami was closed due to non-activity and trying to find some Native Americans that were a bit more willing to be cooperative. Following the demise of the Spanish mission, the area of Miami would not really be settled. Various peoples would come in, try and claim land, but never really do anything concretely, not to mention the Tequesta Indians by this point are now gone. The 1700s would see the Spanish and British flip-flop with control over the area and never really establishing much of anything. That is until 1800 when Pedro Fornells would settle the island of Key Biscayne. However, after 6 months, he felt that there wasn't really much to do with Key Biscayne and he would go back up to St. Augustine. However, on a return voyage back in 1803, he would notice that squatters had settled on the Miami mainland. Now, where these squatters came from, they were either people immigrating from the northern part of Florida or also Bahamians who made the voyage across and settled on the banks, especially in the area we now know today as Coconut Grove. Now, as for the United States, which by the early 1800s is now in possession of the area of Florida and its state, in 1825, the quote-unquote squatters would demand the legitimate ownership of the land that they were squatting on. And as such, the United States would grant it to them in order to try and develop the area of South Florida. Now, the key development is the building of Cape Florida and its lighthouse on the island of Key Biscayne. Now, the original lighthouse was built in 1825. However, it would soon be destroyed within the next 2 decades. And that is due to the biggest impact on Miami's development at this time, the Seminole Indian Wars. The Seminole Indian Wars, lasting from 1835 until 1842, was actually the second in series of wars between the Seminole Nation and the United States military. The United States military was attempting to relocate the Seminole Indian tribe over to the Oklahoma Territory, however, they had refused. Also within the numbers of Seminole Indians were scores of runaway slaves who had joined the tribe and were now escaping along with them to southern Florida. As the U.S. Army began to chase them further south, it became necessary to establish a military outpost in the area. Now, there was a plantation known as Fitzgerald Plantation. Now, the United States Army would take hold of this plantation and establish what was known as Fort Dallas as a way that they could go and attack the Seminole Indian tribe that was hiding out within the Everglades of South Florida. Now, the Second Seminole Indian War would cause damage in the area today known as Miami. The Seminole Indians, along with runaway slaves, would attack the lighthouse on Key Biscayne. They would attack Cape Florida and actually take over the island. Now, seeing their fate was kind of being settled, many of the runaway slaves would actually use Key Biscayne as their way to try to escape to the Bahamas, sailing that way and avoiding the attacks of the United States military. Following the Second Seminole Indian War, Fitzpatrick's nephew would reclaim the plantation. A man by the name of William English will reestablish it and call it the Village of Miami. Now, this spelling is a variation of where he gets the name from. Now, originally, where Miami comes from is from the Miami Indians, which were a Native American group that settled along Lake Okeechobee. And interestingly enough, Okeechobee was not the original name of that body of water. Instead, it was Lake Miami, named after the Native Americans who lived there. Now, Miami translates to big water in their native language. And soon the village of Miami would begin to try and thrive in the 1850s. However, following a third Seminole Indian War, people aren't exactly willing to want to move to a place where there are constant Native American attacks, especially during the latter half of the 1800s. So it isn't really until the 1890s when new settlers begin to come down to Miami and eventually will create the city that we know in 1896. The last half of the 19th century only saw a maximum of 96 people living in the area of Miami-Dade County. Now, the most prominent of them was William and Mary Brickell, who you might imagine lived in the area that's now today known as Brickell, which is south of the Miami River. Now, there are other communities within Dade County outside of the city of Miami. You have Lemon City, which is today known as Little Haiti, the town of Cutler, now Cutler Bay, Palmetto Bay, Coconut Grove, not to mention Miami Shores, which was then known as Biscayne. However, the fortunes of Miami would change when one person decides to leave Cleveland for the glory of South Beach. Miami. Now, in 1891, Julia Tuttle will move from Cleveland following the death of her husband. She meets with William and Mary Brickell, who are her opposite of the Miami River neighbors. She lives on the north end while they live on the south end. They are desperate to make Miami a vibrant community and a thriving community. And what they saw prospering up to the north was Henry Flagler and his Florida East Coast Railway, which stretched all the way from Jacksonville down to Palm Beach. Now, Julia Tuttle is going to try and convince Henry Flagler in order to bring his railroad down to Miami and eventually to the Florida Keys. Now, she wants to convince Flagler to build his station near her property on the mouth of the Miami River. There are competing offers for areas that we know today as Homestead, not to mention Cutler. However, Julia Tuttle was able to convince Henry Flagler finally, following two catastrophic events involving Florida's agriculture industry. In December of 1894 and February of 1895, the state of Florida is hit by very deep freezes, ruining the citrus crop that season. Now, what Julia Tuttle was able to promote to Henry Flagler, much like anyone else who lives in Miami, she promised a frost and freeze-proof area. Flagler would send his men and investigate the claim. Seeing that Miami had not frozen, he ultimately decides to build the railroad all the way down to the city of Miami. Not to mention, Julia Tuttle will hand over 100 acres so Henry Flagler can complete his hotel and initial city layout. The construction of the railroad will begin on March 3rd from West Palm Beach and make its way to the city of Miami on April 7th of 1896, that same year. Less than a week later, on April 13th, the first train will arrive from Palm Beach with Henry Flagler aboard. Later that same year in the summer, July 28, 1896, the city of Miami would officially be incorporated. With 502 people now residing in the area, they would hold a vote and decide to make Miami a city. Now, they would elect John B. Riley as their first mayor, but perhaps one of the most important things of this election is that it is one of the few times in the South that black men are allowed to vote. Of the original 502 voters, 100 of them are African American, and they are allowed to vote as it was required for the amount of people in order to actually incorporate the city. But even in spite of this, segregation, as you might imagine, is still running rampant. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson, also in 1896, legalized segregation. Now, the reason why these black men were here was that they were the ones who were hired to build the railroad. However, they would not be allowed to live on the banks of the Miami River. They would not be allowed to enjoy the beaches like Key Biscayne or eventually Miami Beach. Instead, they were sent to live on the other side of the tracks, that neighborhood being known as Color Town, or today, Overtown. So, that's it for part 1 of the history of Miami. Next class, we'll talk about how Miami begins to thrive in the 1920s and then ultimately brought down by a hurricane. We'll also talk about how Miami rises once again following World War II, not to mention the first wave of immigration coming over to the city of Miami. So thank you, and stay tuned for next week's post.